Henry Coleman had always lived by numbers. For 30 years he had worked at the bank, rising before dawn, balancing ledgers with a discipline that made him both respected and quietly feared. Now, retired at 68, his mornings were filled with simpler rituals: a strong cup of coffee, the newspaper folded neatly by his chair, and sometimes the habit of flipping through old financial records he had kept as carefully as family photo albums. But this morning was unlike any other. Today his daughter Emily was getting married. The church was glowing with soft golden light, flowers cascading down the pews, music lifting into the air. Henry stood tall in his dark suit, watching as Emily, radiant in her white dress, walked toward her future. For a moment his eyes brimmed, not with sadness but with pride. Margaret, his wife of 4 decades, moved gracefully among the guests, smiling as though she were the conductor of the entire celebration. After the vows were spoken and applause filled the room, Henry pulled Emily and her new husband, Jason Miller, aside. His hands trembled slightly as he handed them a small envelope. Emily tilted her head, curious. "Dad, what is this?" Henry smiled gently. "My gift to you both. A house, and a savings account to go with it. It's my way of making sure you start your life together, on steady ground." Jason's eyes flickered, a spark of excitement crossing his face before he masked it with practiced humility. "Mr. Coleman, this is far too generous. I don't know what to say. Thank you." Truly, Emily threw her arms around her father. "Dad, you've always been my protector." Henry held her close, inhaling the scent of her hair, holding on to the little girl who once clutched his hand crossing busy streets. He felt the deep satisfaction of a father who had fulfilled his duty. Yet somewhere deep inside, an unease stirred, a faint whisper that the story had only just begun. That night, as the last of the guests departed, and laughter echoed faintly in the distance, Henry's gift sat like a seed waiting to sprout. He could not know that what he had given in love would become the very foundation of betrayal, conspiracy, and the harshest test of his life. The weeks after the wedding passed in a blur of dinners, polite gatherings, and congratulatory visits. Henry tried to ignore the hollow quiet of his home, now that Emily had moved into the house he had gifted her. Margaret filled the silence with chatter, often praising Jason for his ambition and vision for the future. Henry listened, nodding, though he rarely replied. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed more than words. Still, something gnawed at him. Jason had a way of smiling too easily, of speaking in phrases that sounded polished but shallow, as if they had been rehearsed. He was courteous enough, respectful even, but Henry sensed something restless beneath his charm, something that never sat still. One evening, Henry visited Emily and Jason's new home. It was a modern 2-story house with wide windows that caught the sunset and a backyard that opened into a line of whispering pines. Emily greeted him warmly, though Jason's welcome felt more like a performance than genuine affection. After dinner, Henry excused himself to step outside. He wandered toward the garden, enjoying the cool night air. That was when he heard it. Through the study window, Jason's voice carried low but sharp. "He has no idea, Emily. Your father thinks he's given us a gift, but really he's given us leverage. With his assets and my strategy, we'll build something far beyond what he ever imagined." Henry froze, his heart thudding. Emily's voice was softer, uncertain. "Jason, please, don't talk about him like that. He's done so much for us." Jason laughed quietly, a sound without warmth. "I respect him, Emily, but he's old-fashioned. He doesn't see the bigger picture. By the time he realizes what's happening, we'll already be ahead." Henry stepped back into the shadows, careful not to be seen. His chest felt tight, not just with anger, but with something heavier, disappointment. He had hoped Jason's eagerness was nothing more than a young man's drive to succeed. But now he heard the edge of calculation, the unmistakable tone of someone who saw people not as family, but as obstacles or assets. He lingered in the dark, listening as Jason's voice softened into sweet reassurances meant for Emily. Henry couldn't hear every word, but the rhythm was familiar, charm to soothe, ambition to conceal. On the drive home, Margaret noticed his silence. "You didn't say much tonight," she remarked. Henry kept his eyes on the road. "Just tired," he said simply. But in his mind, the words replayed over and over. Leverage, ahead. He has no idea. That night, Henry sat in his study, long after Margaret had gone to bed. He opened one of his old ledgers, running his finger across the neat columns of ink. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his old disciplines stir. He had once been the man who caught errors buried in endless pages of numbers, the one who saw patterns no one else noticed. And now he realized he would need to be that man again. Henry Coleman had always believed that truth, like numbers, had a way of revealing itself if you looked closely enough. Numbers couldn't lie. They could be bent, rearranged, disguised in columns and clever entries, but the truth always surfaced for anyone patient enough to follow the trail. In the weeks after overhearing Jason's late-night words, Henry began to watch with sharper eyes. At dinners, he noticed Jason excusing himself frequently to take phone calls. At gatherings, Jason always found ways to boast about his big opportunities without ever giving real details. And every time Margaret sang Jason's praises, Henry felt the weight of unease deepen in his chest. One Saturday afternoon, Henry stopped by unannounced at Emily's new house. Emily was out with friends, but Jason was home, working in the study. Jason greeted him with polite surprise, offering coffee while quickly sliding a folder into a desk drawer. Henry noticed. He stayed only long enough to ask after Emily, but his eyes took in every detail: the folder's label, the stack of unopened envelopes, the faint glow of a laptop screen minimized too quickly. It was the same instinct that had served him during his banking years. People hid things in plain sight, assuming no one was observant enough to notice. That night, Henry returned to his study. He pulled an old leather-bound notebook from the shelf, one he had once used for balancing accounts, and began jotting down dates, details, and fragments of what he had seen and heard. A pattern was beginning to form. Soon after, he asked Emily casually about their finances. She smiled, saying Jason had everything handled and that he was planning their investments for the future. The words felt rehearsed, borrowed from Jason's tongue. Henry didn't press her. Instead, he began his own quiet investigation. Using contacts from his years at the bank, Henry requested routine account reports tied to the savings he had gifted Emily. At first glance, everything appeared normal, but Henry noticed unusual withdrawals, small enough to slip by unnoticed, yet steady and systematic, the kind of pattern designed to bleed slowly without raising alarms. He compared dates and amounts against Jason's, boasting about opportunities. The match was too neat to be coincidence. Money was leaving, and Jason was moving it through channels Emily likely knew nothing about. One evening, Henry drove past Jason's office after hours. Through the lit windows, he saw Jason hunched over papers, phone pressed to his ear, his gestures sharp and impatient. Henry parked across the street just long enough to see Jason pull a second briefcase from under his desk, one he never carried to family dinners. The pieces were fitting together. But Henry wasn't reckless. He didn't storm into the office. He didn't accuse Jason at home. Instead, he sharpened his pen, filed his notes, and began building a ledger of truth. Every withdrawal, every suspicious folder, every late-night phone call, it all went into his growing record. Margaret noticed his renewed habit of writing late into the night. "You're keeping books again," she remarked, her voice half curious, half dismissive. Henry closed the ledger gently. "Just old habits," he said. But inside, he knew it was more than habit. It was preparation. For years he had believed retirement meant leaving behind the vigilance that once defined him. But Jason's ambition had awakened something he thought he'd buried, the quiet patience of a man who could wait weeks, months, even years for a single discrepancy to reveal the truth. And this time. The truth wasn't about numbers on a bank's ledger. It was about protecting his daughter and reclaiming his dignity. The Coleman's home had always been a place of warmth, filled with the rhythm of Margaret's laughter and Henry's quiet steadiness. But lately Henry noticed a shift in the air, subtle at first, then sharper with each passing week. Margaret had grown distant. She no longer lingered over morning coffee with him, no longer asked about the newspaper headlines or teased him for his stubborn routines. Instead, her voice lit up whenever Jason's name appeared in conversation. "He's so forward-thinking," she would say, her eyes glowing in a way Henry hadn't seen in years. "Jason has vision. He knows how to turn opportunity into success." Henry would nod, sipping his coffee in silence, but each compliment cut deeper than the last. One evening, after a quiet dinner at home, Margaret placed her fork down and looked across the table. "Henry, don't you think you're being too suspicious of Jason? He's trying. He wants the best for Emily." Henry studied her, weighing his words carefully. "I've spent my life watching numbers, Margaret, and numbers don't lie. Jason is moving money where it doesn't belong." Her expression hardened, as though he had insulted her directly. "You're retired, Henry. Maybe you're just out of touch. Times have changed. Jason knows the modern world better than either of us." The words stung, not because she defended Jason, but because she dismissed him, the man who had built their life with discipline and care. That night, Henry sat in his study, long after Margaret had gone to bed. He stared at the ledger he had been keeping, the neat columns of evidence growing thicker by the day. The truth was there in black ink. Yet inside his own home, it felt as though no one wanted to see it. The next weekend, Emily and Jason invited them over for dinner. Jason charmed the evening, telling stories of business ventures and future plans, his smile polished, his hand resting possessively on Emily's. Margaret laughed at his jokes, her eyes shining with admiration. Henry remained quiet, observing. When Jason excused himself to take a phone call, Henry caught the way Margaret leaned toward Emily, whispering, "You're lucky, you know. Your husband is going places." Emily smiled politely, though her eyes seemed uncertain, flickering briefly toward her father. Henry noticed it, a hesitation, the first crack in her blind faith. On the drive home, Margaret's voice was sharp. "You hardly said a word tonight. Do you want people to think you disapprove of Jason?" Henry kept his eyes on the road. "I don't need to say anything. Time will reveal the truth." She shook her head, turning toward the window. "Sometimes I think you'd rather be right than be happy." The words lingered in the car long after the headlights swept across their driveway. Henry understood then that Margaret had chosen her side, or at least convinced herself that Jason's success meant stability, wealth, perhaps even excitement she had craved in her later years. Whatever her reasons, her loyalty was no longer with him. In the quiet of his study that night, Henry opened his ledger again. The pages were filling quickly now. Transactions, notes, observations, even the dates of Jason's late-night calls. Each line felt like a brick, building a wall between him and Margaret. For the first time in his marriage, Henry felt truly alone, but solitude had never frightened him. If anything, it sharpened his focus. If his wife chose to stand with Jason, then Henry would stand with the truth. Henry Coleman had always believed in timing. In his years at the bank, he had learned that patience was not the absence of action, but the art of waiting for the precise moment to strike. Now, as he watched Jason grow bolder, as Margaret's loyalty drifted further from him, Henry knew it was time to remind his son-in-law that nothing escaped his eyes. It was late afternoon when Henry decided to pay Jason a visit at his office. The building was sleek and modern, a sharp contrast to the quiet dignity of Henry's own home. He walked through the glass doors in his dark suit, carrying himself with the calm confidence of a man who had weathered storms far greater than the arrogance of youth. Jason looked up from his desk, visibly surprised. "Mr. Coleman," he said, forcing a smile. "What a surprise! To what do I owe the pleasure?" Henry took a seat without waiting for an invitation. His steady gaze swept across the room, noting the folders stacked neatly on one side, the second briefcase half hidden behind the desk. Nothing escaped him. "I thought it was time we had a talk," Henry said evenly. His tone was polite, but there was steel beneath the words. Jason leaned back, trying to mask his discomfort with charm. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Henry folded his hands on the desk between them. "I've been watching." "You're ambitious, Jason. Ambition can be a strength, but it can also be a danger when it blinds a man to the truth." Jason laughed lightly, though his fingers tapped against the arm of his chair. "I assure you, sir, everything I do is for Emily." "For our future," Henry's eyes didn't waver. "I hope so. But let me be clear. I built my life on numbers. I know when something doesn't add up, and I see more than you think." The room fell silent for a moment, the air charged with unspoken tension. Jason's smile faltered. He adjusted his tie, leaning forward. "Are you accusing me of something?" Henry shook his head slowly. "No accusations, just a courtesy. A reminder that I am not as blind as I may look." Jason swallowed, the mask slipping just enough for Henry to catch the flicker of unease in his eyes. Then Jason forced another smile. "Of course, Mr. Coleman, I respect your experience, truly, but times have changed. I'd never do anything to harm Emily, or you." Henry rose, smoothing the front of his suit. "Good. I'll hold you to that." As he turned to leave, Henry paused at the door. Without looking back, he said, "One more thing, Jason. Trust is like money. Easy to spend, difficult to earn back." The words hung in the air as Henry walked out, leaving Jason sitting rigid behind his desk, the forced smile gone. Outside, the winter sun was sinking, painting the city in shades of gold and shadow. Henry drew in a deep breath. He had not raised his voice, had not made a direct threat, but he had seen the shift in Jason's posture, the way his mask had cracked. That was enough. On the drive home, Henry felt a rare calm. For the first time since the wedding, he knew Jason understood. Someone was watching, someone who could not be deceived. But Henry also knew this confrontation was not the end. It was only the opening move. Emily had always believed her father and husband were two very different men, yet both dependable in their own way. Her father, Henry, was steady, cautious, and deliberate. Jason was energetic, ambitious, and full of charm. To her, they were opposite ends of a balance, one offering wisdom, the other excitement. But lately the scales no longer seemed even. It began with small things. Jason started coming home later than usual, brushing off her questions with vague answers about meetings and opportunities. He carried his phone everywhere, lowering his voice when he spoke, slipping into the study and shutting the door behind him. When Emily asked who he was talking to, he would smile and kiss her forehead, saying, "Don't worry, love. It's just business." At first she tried to accept it. Marriage was new, and Jason was under pressure to provide. But then came the night she passed by the study and heard him speaking more sharply than usual. "Henry's too careful. He's watching me," Jason said, his tone tense. "But it doesn't matter. Margaret is on our side. As long as she keeps him calm, we'll have room to move." Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her father's name. Her mother's name. And Jason's voice, clipped, strategic, as if he were plotting around them rather than with them. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and Jason's voice immediately softened. By the time she opened the door, he was smiling again, phone tucked away. "Hey, sweetheart. Couldn't sleep?" She nodded faintly, too shaken to speak. That night, Emily lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling. The certainty she had carried since her wedding day began to tremble. Her father's quiet unease, his silence at dinners, the way his eyes lingered on Jason, it all began to make sense. The next afternoon, Emily visited her parents. Margaret was cheerful as always. quick to praise Jason's drive and leadership, but Henry remained quiet, observing, his eyes steady as though searching for answers without asking questions. When Margaret left the room to fetch tea, Emily finally spoke. "Dad, do you trust Jason?" Henry's eyes softened, though he did not smile. "Trust is earned, Emily, and sometimes people spend it faster than they realize." Her throat tightened. "I overheard him last night. He was talking about you and Mom, as if you were obstacles." Henry leaned forward, resting his hands on hers. "Then you've heard what I've known for some time. Jason is not the man he pretends to be." Emily's heart sank. "But what if I've made a mistake? What if marrying him was—" Henry shook his head gently. "You didn't make a mistake. You trusted someone who wanted to be trusted. That's not a flaw, Emily. That's love. But love must be honest to survive." Margaret returned then, smiling as she handed Emily a cup of tea, unaware of the heavy silence she had interrupted. Emily glanced between her parents, the father who had always protected her, and the mother who seemed blind to the danger creeping into their family. That night, back at her home, Emily studied Jason more closely. His easy laughter, his smooth reassurances, all of it felt like a mask she had never thought to question. For the first time, she wondered what might lie beneath it, and in that wondering, doubt took root. Henry Coleman had spent months collecting fragments, receipts tucked into folders, suspicious withdrawals, dates scribbled into his ledger. Each detail alone might have seemed harmless, but together they painted a picture of deliberate deceit. Now the time had come to turn those fragments into something undeniable. Through an old friend at the bank, Henry was introduced to Karen Black, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for uncovering financial fraud. She was sharp, her voice calm but firm, and she listened intently as Henry laid out his story in her office, his ledger open on the desk between them. "You've done half my work already," Karen remarked, flipping through the meticulous notes. "These patterns are too consistent to be chance. Jason isn't just careless, he's systematic. He's funneling money." Henry nodded. "I needed someone who could put this in the right hands. I'm not looking for vengeance. I'm looking for truth." Karen studied him for a moment, as though weighing his resolve. Then she smiled faintly. "Truth can be a weapon, Mr. Coleman. If you're ready to use it, I'll make sure it's heard." The next step was bringing in an expert. Karen introduced Henry to David Harris, a forensic accountant with a reputation for uncovering schemes buried beneath layers of false entries. David was methodical, quiet, almost monk-like in his concentration. He pored over Henry's notes, then requested bank statements, tax filings, and corporate records connected to Jason. Days turned into weeks as David unraveled the threads. He found shell accounts, money transferred through small businesses Jason had set up in his name, and a trail of funds redirected from the savings Henry had gifted to Emily. "It's all here," David said finally, pushing a stack of organized files toward Henry and Karen. "Every move he's made." Enough to stand in any courtroom, Henry felt both relief and sorrow wash over him. The evidence was no longer just numbers in his private ledger. It was hard truth, ready to be tested. But evidence alone was not enough. Karen advised caution. "We don't tip our hand until the time is right. Jason believes he's untouchable. Let him think that a little longer. When the papers land, he won't have room to maneuver." Meanwhile, at home, Margaret grew increasingly frustrated with Henry's silence. "You spend more time in that study than with your family," she complained one evening. "Jason is building a future for Emily, and all you do is brood." Henry looked at her, his eyes calm but tired. Sometimes brooding is the only way to see what others refuse to. She shook her head, unwilling to listen. Her loyalty to Jason blinded her, and Henry no longer tried to convince her otherwise. He knew the truth would speak louder than his words ever could. One night, Emily visited quietly, without Jason. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she held a small notebook of her own. "I've started keeping track," she whispered, sliding it across the table. Inside were dates and conversations she had overheard, snatches of Jason's phone calls, notes about his meetings, even Margaret's private encouragements. Henry's chest tightened. "You've done well, Emily. This may be harder than you realize, but it's necessary." She met his eyes, tears threatening to spill. "I don't want to lose everything, Dad. But I don't want to lose myself either. I need to stand with the truth." Henry placed a steady hand over hers. "And you will. We both will." By the time Karen filed the first set of motions, the case against Jason was airtight. Henry's ledger, David's analysis, Emily's testimony, all of it formed a web too strong for Jason to wriggle free from. For months, Henry had lived in silence, waiting. Now that silence was about to echo in a courtroom, where numbers would tell their story and the masks would fall away. The courtroom was cold, its tall windows letting in pale morning light that pooled across the polished wooden floors. Henry Coleman sat at the plaintiff's table beside Karen Black, his attorney, with David Harris's files stacked neatly before them. His hands were folded, his posture calm, but inside his chest beat a steady drum of anticipation. Across the room sat Jason Miller, sharp in a tailored suit, his smile subdued but still present, as though he believed charm could bend even a judge's ear. Beside him, Margaret Coleman sat rigid, her eyes darting between her husband and her son-in-law, torn yet visibly aligned with Jason. Henry did not look at her. His focus was forward. When the judge entered, silence fell. The case was called, and the air thickened with the weight of family secrets about to be dragged into the open. Karen spoke first, her voice steady, confident. "Your Honor, what we present today is not speculation. It is evidence. Mr. Jason Miller systematically drained assets entrusted to him through his wife, Emily. Assets given as a wedding gift by her father, Henry Coleman. We will show financial records, bank transfers, and corroborating testimony to prove deliberate fraud and manipulation." Jason leaned back, feigning boredom, but Henry saw the tension in his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers. David Harris took the stand, presenting charts and spreadsheets with calm precision. He explained how Jason had moved money through shell accounts, disguising withdrawals as business expenses. Every line was supported with documentation, every point grounded in numbers Jason could not easily deny. Then came the moment Henry both feared and trusted, the moment Emily would take the stand. She rose slowly, her face pale but her eyes steady. As she swore the oath and sat down, Henry felt a pang of pride mixed with sorrow. No father ever wanted his daughter to be caught between loyalty to her husband and to her blood, yet here she was, choosing to speak. Karen's questions were gentle at first. "Emily, can you tell the court in your own words what you've observed in your home regarding your husband's financial dealings?" Emily's voice trembled, but she did not falter. "I've overheard Jason speaking about my father, not with respect, but as someone to be worked around," he said. "He said Dad had no idea what was happening, that by the time he realized, it would be too late. I also kept notes of phone calls and late-night meetings. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces began to match what Dad feared." Jason shifted in his chair, his smile fading. Karen leaned closer. "Emily, this is difficult. But I must ask, where do you stand now between your husband and your father?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Emily's eyes glistened, but her voice was clear. "I stand with the truth. And the truth is with my father." The words echoed through the courtroom. Henry's throat tightened, and for a brief moment, the weight of months of isolation lifted. His daughter had chosen not comfort, not denial, but courage. Jason slammed his hand on the table, muttering to his lawyer, "She's confused. He's manipulated her." But the judge silenced him with a sharp glance. Margaret's face turned pale. Her lips pressed thin, but she did not speak. By the end of the day, the evidence was overwhelming. Jason's attorney tried to spin the narrative as a series of innocent mistakes. ambitious ventures that looked worse than they were. But the documents, Emily's testimony, and David's analysis formed a chain too tight to break. As the session adjourned, Henry caught Emily's eye. She gave a small nod, as though to say, "I'm with you now, Dad." And in that silent exchange, Henry found something stronger than victory. He found his family again, or at least the part of it that still remembered truth. The trial stretched into days, each one stripping away another layer of Jason Miller's polished facade. What began as smug confidence shifted into restless agitation, and finally into raw desperation. The man who once carried himself like a rising star now looked like a cornered animal, pacing behind the defense table, whispering furiously to his lawyer. Henry Coleman watched it all with the steady calm of someone who had weathered storms before. He did not gloat, he did not smile. He simply observed, letting the numbers and the truth speak louder than vengeance ever could. The final blow came when David Harris produced a set of records tracing funds not only from Emily's savings, but also from Margaret's private accounts. The room stirred as David explained how Jason had persuaded Margaret to invest in his ventures, all while quietly draining her finances for his own hidden projects. Margaret's face went white. She turned to Jason, her lips trembling. "You told me this was for us." "You said—" Jason grabbed her arm under the table, whispering harshly, but the damage was done. The betrayal was no longer just Henry's to bear. It had reached Margaret, too. When Karen Black rose for her closing argument, her words were measured and deliberate. "Your Honor, this case is not simply about fraud. It is about trust. Trust given freely by a father to his daughter and her husband, only to be twisted into leverage for personal gain. Mr. Coleman did not come here seeking revenge. He came seeking justice, and the evidence leaves no room for doubt." The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Jason was found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. His assets were frozen, his accounts seized, and his professional licenses revoked. The sentence ensured not only financial ruin, but the collapse of his career. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jason's lawyer slumped in defeat. Jason himself stood motionless for a moment, his eyes darting from the judge to Emily, then to Henry. The charm was gone, replaced with bitterness and rage. "You did this!" he hissed at Henry, his voice low but venomous. "You destroyed me." Henry met his gaze with calm dignity. "No, Jason, you destroyed yourself. I just refused to let you take my daughter with you." Jason was escorted out in handcuffs, his head lowered, the weight of his downfall pressing against the silence of the room. Margaret sat frozen, staring at the floor. For months, she had defended Jason, praised him, even turned against her own husband in his favor. Now, confronted with the truth, she looked hollow, her loyalty shattered. She rose slowly, unable to meet Henry's eyes, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Emily remained, tears streaming down her face. She moved to her father's side, gripping his hand tightly. "It's over, Dad," she whispered. Henry squeezed her hand, his own eyes damp but steady. "No, Emily. This is just the beginning. The truth is free now. And so are we." That night, as Henry sat alone in his study, he opened his leather ledger one last time. The pages were filled with months of notes, calculations, and observations, the silent record of a battle fought in patience and resolve. He closed it slowly, placing it on the shelf. Its purpose had been served. For Jason, the fall was final. For Henry, it was vindication. But for Emily, it was a lesson that would echo for the rest of her life. That trust, once broken, can never be repaired in the same shape. And somewhere in the silence of his home, Henry allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Justice had been slow, but it had arrived. The days after the trial unfolded in a strange quiet. The chaos of courtrooms and tense testimonies gave way to silence, thick, unfamiliar silence that wrapped around Henry Coleman's home. Jason was gone, his name reduced to headlines about fraud and betrayal. Margaret had retreated to her sister's house, unable to face Henry or Emily after siding so blindly with a man who had nearly destroyed their family. And Henry, for the first time in months, felt the heavy weight of vigilance lift from his shoulders. He sat in his study one morning, sunlight spilling across his desk, the leather ledger resting before him. The pages were full now, dates, withdrawals, conversations, all carefully recorded in the same tidy handwriting he had used during his banking years. It was not just a record of Jason's crimes. It had become a record of his own endurance, of the patience and discipline that had carried him through the storm. Emily entered quietly, her steps soft. She looked older somehow, not in years, but in spirit, as though the trial had carved away the last remnants of innocence. She placed a hand on her father's shoulder. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked. Henry closed the ledger gently, his fingers lingering on its worn cover. "I am now." "It's over." Emily sat beside him, her voice low but firm. "You saved me. You saw what I couldn't. I don't know how to thank you." Henry smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "You don't need to thank me. A father protects. That's what I've always done, and what I'll always do." She leaned against him, and for the first time since her wedding, Henry felt the bond between them restored, stronger, forged by fire rather than circumstance. Later that week, Margaret returned. She stood at the doorway of Henry's study, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with shame. "Henry, I was wrong," she whispered. "I let myself be blinded." "I chose the wrong side." Henry looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking softly in the background. Then he said, "We all make choices. Some bring us closer, some tear us apart. What matters now is whether we learn from them." Margaret lowered her gaze, tears slipping down her cheeks. She left without pressing further, leaving Henry alone once more. That night, Henry carried the ledger out to the porch. The evening air was cool, the sky painted in shades of fading gold. He sat with a book on his lap, flipping through the pages one last time. Each entry felt like a scar, a reminder of betrayal, but also of resilience. When he reached the final page, he pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote a single line. "Justice served, lesson kept." Then he closed the ledger and set it aside. The next morning he placed the book in a locked drawer. He would not destroy it. Truth, he believed, should never be erased. But he no longer needed to carry it with him. From that day forward, Henry lived quietly, his dignity intact, his bond with Emily unshaken. The skyscrapers of the city gleamed as they always had, indifferent to the storms of individual lives. But Henry knew he had endured his storm with patience, with discipline, and with quiet strength. And though he never sought revenge, the world had given it to him in the purest form. The truth laid bare, and a betrayer brought low by his own hand. Henry Coleman, the banker, the father, the husband, closed that chapter of his life not with bitterness, but with resolve. For in the end, the greatest victory was not Jason's downfall. It was that Henry never lost himself.